So you've heard what I did when I was in government, and now I'm doing it for businesses, and I'm doing it internationally with the Brunswick Group, and I'm also working with technology companies on investments in emerging technologies. And I'm really excited to be here today. In government, and in a way with businesses, my job was to absolutely manifest that great British sign that some of you will have on your fridges, which says, keep calm and carry on. In that, if you listen to that list of things for which I was responsible, and can I commend to you the national, can I ask British people in the room, how many of you have looked at the National Risk Register? Has anybody? No, not a single person. I can't quite see.
There's
one.
Yeah.
Oh, great, okay. This is with a group of risk practitioners in the room, and not one of you has looked at something that the British state has poured all of its effort into capturing the things it needs to think about. So that's a good start. If you look at all the things for which I was responsible, and when I used to walk into the room, David Cameron's great joke, because there weren't many jokes for the stuff I dealt with, was to say, here's the deep state. If you look at those things, they are in some ways unavoidable. They come at us, and they're a catalogue of all the bad things that can happen. And as I say, I commend the National Risk Register to you. I reflect, though, that my job was absolutely to make sure that we could respond to any of those eventualities, the most extreme eventualities that the state has to deal with. And my biggest problem was to keep people's feet on the ground once we started talking about them. Now, you saw or you heard from Andrew, my title, which was Intelligence, Security and Resilience. And consistently I find that people focus on the first two, intelligence and security, because it's exciting to their mind. You know, it's about James Bond, and it's about, the secret state and all of that. But the one, to my mind, that really mattered was that resilience title, which was about the British state's ability to use risk to plan, and to plan for any eventuality. And it was absolutely crucial. And I found recently it's incredibly frustrating that as I've gone out into the world and began to work on other issues, people keep on dragging me back to what they think is exciting. Recently I did a thing with Oxford University around how we secure elections in an age of technology, mindful of the kind of things that Andy was saying in his introduction, of the risks that there are around technology, and came up with a set of proposals that could make elections safer, that could manage down the risk, and found that the BBC only wanted to talk to me about Russia, not about the things we could actually do to bring down the threat. One of the reasons I'm really excited to be here today is that I'm put in mind of what Bill Gates has been doing, making use of that Hans Rosling book, Factfulness. And I had the good fortune to go and meet him and talk about this book and his use of it, me and several other people, it's got to be said, it wasn't only me. And what he was trying to do was to get people to recognize the reality that things are a lot better than they've been. And what I found with that keep calm and carry on thing, the critical thing I needed to be able to do was to provide an evidence base for the reality of what was happening. That was the absolutely thing that could bring politicians, everybody's feet down to the ground. So, which is why I focused on the resilience task. So today, just quickly, I want to run through a couple of things that strike me currently, which I think are highly relevant to our discussions today. So threats happen. People do put chemical weapons on doorknobs in Salisbury, once in my lifetime. And, I dealt with 5 successful terrorist attacks in 2017, and major cyber attacks, and I had to deal with the the British response to the Ebola epidemic. Not great material for comedy, Andrew.
No.
But there we are. There you go. That does happen. So those things do happen, but the thing that come around again and again and again are hazard events. Yeah? Just think, those of you who are British, about what's in our news at the moment. There are floods, and there are buildings that are burnt. Yeah? And there are indeed currently a whole decision of banking systems which have failed due to perhaps poor handling by the people implementing changes. And those happen all the time. That's a reality. That stuff happens and has to be dealt with. And increasingly, there's a reliance on resilience tools, and in particular, crisis response. Now, it is not a surprise, either in the world of government or the world of business, and the two are very close together, if the way things are today, we weren't relying on crisis response quite a lot. We weren't relying on short-termism quite a lot. If you're in the United Kingdom and dealing with Brexit, where you don't have much certainty, you will be putting off more systematic decisions. If you are a Hong Kong business, I advise a number of them, it is very difficult to go beyond the immediate. Yeah? And likewise, if you're in the United States in the technology sector and thinking about China, as I'm sure GRC is, that's a really interesting question about how that's going to be in 2020, 2021, and understandably being long-term is, having a long-term view is problematic. The problem with resilience tools, as I learned, the problem with calling COBRAs, or for those of you who aren't British, using government situation rooms, using crisis response is, it's like driving your car on the brakes. It's like driving down a road and rather than looking ahead and really understanding what's happening on the road, relying on your ability to stop very sharply when you come to a bend in the road. And one of the things that happens is that if you rely on those tools rather than a real situational awareness, that becomes your dominant way of doing business. You change the culture of your organisation. I am worried about the British state and the new government that comes in because it's going to have to put back together, after some years of short-termism, put back together the ability to do longer-term risk planning and policy formation because we've been driving on the brakes. So my first thought for you is there's a real risk in not understanding your risks. The second thing I just wanted to touch on was the differences that I see having been in government and now working in business. Now, when states, and in particular a state like the United Kingdom, is dealing with a threat, something bad happens, you're attacked by a terrorist group or your National Health Service is hacked in one way or another, amongst other bodies in the world, you very quickly develop phenomenal situational awareness because you have these fantastic organizations in the intelligence and security bit of what I dealt with. So you very quickly have that, but you have it kind of episodically and occasionally on the most important things. Also, sitting at the centre of government, you have culpability in a way perhaps that business doesn't. The risks that I walked into Cameron and then May's office with, that I went into the White House to talk to first the Obama and then the Trump administration about, or into the Macron's team, those were not ones we could transfer. Now, I've got to say, politicians do like to do risk transfer. They like to create arm's-length bodies they can blame for a failure of the performance of government. They like to regulate so that business has to do it. And they love to do a thing which I call blame storming, which is something happens and the first thing you have to work out is who's to blame, because otherwise it'll be me.
Oh my God.
Which is a favourite thing to do. But the reality is that the buck stops with them, and we're seeing that at the moment. I mean, in my word, George W. Bush learned it when New Orleans flooded. That you can handle these things well and you can handle them badly. And of course, the other aspect of being in government that you don't have in business is, my word, you have authority. When it comes to it, if you really need to do something, you can act in response. Right or wrong, but you can act. But I'm finding that CEOs are not that different a position from prime ministers. And incidentally, I don't take responsibility for this. All the decisions of David Cameron and Theresa May. Can I just say that? Should have said that at the beginning of the disclaimer, I think. Because they've got devolved authority. If you think about the flooding that we're discussing around the Don in Yorkshire at the moment, if you're British, the decision-making chain, the risk-taking chain there is very, very far from central authority. The idea that a Prime Minister can in some way reach that, very limited. I did some work with the Indian Home Minister a few years ago, trying to have some effect at the edge of the Indian policing system. Can you imagine what it's like to be the Indian with the all the states and all the men and women in the police service to reach to the edge of the system and get something done. He said to me he thought he could have effect in 5 or 10 years' time if he made a decision today and worked it through, if he was lucky and drove it through. That's a bit of a feeling that.
Wow.
My experience is increasingly boardrooms and cabinet rooms are not actually fundamentally that different. They can be ruly, they can be unruly. You know, it depends, and prime ministers have to deal with it. And CEOs, it seems to me, have the same ticking clock in their ear as, looking around at CEOs, as prime ministers have, that they know they have a limited length of time to get this stuff right, and that gradually the light will change for them. Now, I'm a philosopher's son. My father is a scholar on Wittgenstein, the man who said, of which we cannot speak, thereof we should remain silent. I never understood any of it, so I guess there are questions there for me. But I want to talk about a problem of knowing. And it seems to me this is absolutely vital. So when I was in government, you can imagine the idea of an integrated risk model, of a technology that would genuinely show us where we were on compliance, where we were on risk, within a government department, let alone across government, seemed miles away. You're going to hear in this conference from former colleagues of mine from the Department of Work and Pensions, which processes about 40% of the bank transfers in the United Kingdom on any given day.
Wow.
And you know, so I was always very interested in the compliance there, you can imagine. But add to that the National Health Service, and there isn't the prospect of a single view. But driving towards a clear view and having a crisis mechanism that gave you one was a critical part of the task. And it feels that way in business too. Of course, there weren't any risk disciplines across these departments. They didn't behave the same. And whilst we didn't have mergers and acquisitions, occasionally ministries were jammed together or given new responsibilities. So there was a bit of an analogy with private sector practice. But the critical thing I want to focus on is, increasingly, as we were discussing just before we started, I think, regulators, governments, are creating a risk requirement in their regulation. So that's explicit in the General Data Protection Regulations, in the general security principle that you must take technical and organizational measures appropriate to the risk. It's true in the prudential regulation that we have, certainly in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, around financial institutions, where you have to demonstrate that you have a risk mechanism. And one of the problems we've got is there are certain categories of risk where you cannot get the information and the data. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And I think they drive our thinking today. Now, and you focused on cyber, and cyber seems to me to be a wonderful driver. It's not unique, but it drives a different technology, and it drives a different response. The thing that strikes me about cyber is this. Since I left government, I've been working with major listed corporations who've had cyber crises. And recently I trotted up for Brunswick Group, here in Europe and in the United States, what happened when there was a crisis. And the following, I'm just going to share this with you because I think it tells us something really important. So in Europe, about 70% of the firms we were with felt obliged to communicate with a regulator about a major cyber breach. So if it was an industrial control system, wouldn't be GDPR required. Obviously, if they were in the financial sector, they'd have to have reported. But if they were in the food sector, there was no statutory obligation. So if you listen to that number, it means 30% there was no communication with the regulation. Half in Europe wanted to go public. In the end, about 60% went public, and I could, if I wasn't covered by NDAs, point at the ones I worked on. But that means that 40 to 50% were not public. That if you were relying, sitting on your board to know what was coming at you, to do your risk appraisal, half the things that happened you wouldn't learn about. You wouldn't learn about at all. And interestingly, in Europe, under 40% claimed on insurance. Now, insurance for me is a really interesting indicator. For floods like those we have at the moment, for fires as we've had this weekend in student accommodation, there's a clear actuarial model. There is no actuarial model for cyber. Yeah? Insurance companies are pricing it necessarily in a probabilistic way because they don't have the claim data. So The insurance companies don't know. Your board sure as hell doesn't know. Doesn't know. Can't know. You can know what's happening in your system. You can have good GRC systems that'll tell you how your compliance is going. Absolutely. And you can have a bit of a risk model, but you're not going to have the full picture. And I don't think that's unique to cyber. I was struck talking to GRC colleagues before I came. They said, could you broaden out beyond cyber? I said, yeah, sure, no problem. There've been lots of examples I could draw on. And I went back and looked at governance failures that I have looked at and colleagues have looked at over recent years. So me also over the last year and a half, but then longer. And we're completely covered by NDAs. I am not at liberty to mention most of the things I've worked on. So I'm not allowed to tell you, and no, they're not telling you the reality of their governance failure. So what you're left with is that occasionally you know something. Occasionally you know that a major mining corporation didn't have a proper understanding of its risk around dams. Yeah? And actually all the data was there. All the data was there. Actually the risk management was there and the mitigation was there. It just hadn't escalated up. It hadn't got to the top, hadn't been properly addressed, and my word, it's going to be expensive as a result. Yeah? You've got examples like the Australian banking review that has looked at conduct risk in Australian banks, in particular the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and it brings it to the fore and shows it to you. But it's a very rare thing to see that in all its light. And for me, almost the most interesting indicator that we aren't getting the data we need is the way in which activist shareholders can do so well. If you look at what an activist shareholder does is that their teams look at the data, the GRC data, and they spot something that the board is not addressing. And we know that boards, and we're going to have a session on the C-suite in a while, we know that boards are capable, my word, think of Royal Bank of Scotland. We know that boards are capable of having the information in front of them and not reading it and not understanding it. So there's something really interesting for me about what you do, even when you get your GRC model perfect, when you've got, let's hope in the future, a real actuarial basis based upon, in particular, machine learning and the aggregation of data, there is the prospect of really understanding the full scale of the risk within your business. There's a question of how you relate it to external risk and how you read it. And those two things seems to me to be, if you like, the side wall of the squash court of our conversation today. Yeah? Something we've got to address. Well, we must also address what we do in the building blocks of GRC, how we build our way towards something that's going to give us real compliance, given the attitude of the regulator, but also real advantage, which I think is where we're going with this. People talk about black swan events. I don't believe in black swan events. I don't believe in them at all. I was very disappointed that I hadn't caught, the system that I sponsored, hadn't caught the risk from volcanic eruptions to aviation in my risk register that I used for the nation for 4 years. Yeah? We did 2 iterations of renewal of the risk register with consultation with academia and everything. The risk I missed was that the aviation industry would miscategorize the effect on engines from ash and that aviation would be interrupted. So, and that's one. I'm quite proud of that. Every other risk that looked like it was going to eventuate, I caught in this risk register. There were no black swan events. What there were extreme events that could test us. Yeah? It remained possible that we'd have a major nuclear incident. It certainly remains possible we are due a pandemic. We're due one. So we've got to prepare for it. We're not having a pandemic today. And there's some really interesting examples for me as I go around businesses where people talk about black swan event and I now refuse to engage. I said there's no such thing. You only have to look at what happened to Maersk offshore drilling, yeah, or what happened to Norsk Hydro when they had a ransomware attack. And what did they have to do? They had to run their businesses on social media communications because they had no communication. That tells us that the height of the jump, it's not a black swan event, the height of the jump is, the question you have to ask yourself is, could I run my business without any of my corporate communications of any kind? And that isn't a question I'll ask next year or in 2 years' time? That's a question to ask today. So to my mind, when I look at the risk products I used to rely on, that ability to think about extreme events and test them against your current activity is absolutely critical. It's one of the drivers. And there are two other reasons why you should do that, apart from being ready. One of them is about culture. And I think and Andy referred to culture and how you bring your people with you and how you develop it here. Because it's culture, because after something, those of you who have dealt with major events, the most important people, the day after something has happened, or the moment after something's happened, are your staff. They are the people who are going to dig you out of the hole. And usually if something bad has happened, you find there were other things that were wrong, and people immediately reflect upon themselves. After the 7th of July bombings on the tubes in London, almost our biggest problem was to make sure that our security and police services didn't break themselves with the regret that they had about having missed that, when we needed them to catch the next attack. So absolutely vital thing is culture. And then finally, I think increasingly the thing I am striving for in my professional life is to get to the point where businesses have what I call the technology risk. Now, we used to call it that when I worked at GCHQ Cheltenham, where we looked at all the technologies that were going to enable our mission and obstruct it. So it wasn't a negative thing. It wasn't. I mean, we did say, oh, look, that technology is changing. It's going to mean we can't do X or Y anymore. You know, encryption is coming. We won't be able to intercept communications as we did previously. That's happening. We won't have the same cyber protection anymore. But critically, it's about identifying the high land that's in front of you. What is the technology going to allow for there in 2 years, 5 years, 7 years? So in a business planning cycle. And how are we going to get there? I find very few boards that can characterize that for me. Characterizing that seems to me to be the key for getting the value out of GRC products. Because it tells you what you could get to and what you have to do in the interim. Final point from me. I think we're at an inflection point, just to illustrate that, I think we're at an inflection point with cyber. Increasingly, if you look at the breach data, for instance, Verizon's report for 2018, 80+% of the malware they found in their breaches was either variant or unique. What that means is that most of your antivirus, most of your arrangements were not going to catch it. So all that paperwork that's appearing with the board they're looking at to manage their cyber risk, some of it driven by MetricStream products, can only be as good as what it can detect. But at the same time, we have the prospect of the aggregation of data and machine learning giving us complete models of what's happening on our network systems, such that we'll have an actuarial understanding of what's happening on them and be able to drive down cyber events. So over there we've got a solution, just now we've got a problem, and we've got to bridge that somehow with intense working. That's the way I'm afraid to say my mind works, and that's what enables me to keep calm and carry on. You're going to join me up here? Or am I going to do questions on my own?
I bring you water.
Oh, thank you very much. Do I sound dry?
That's £1.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So just to let you know, Paddy, I gave you 5 stars for that on the app. That was very good.
I couldn't log into the app. It wouldn't let me in. Right now.
Go on. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, a round of applause for Paddy, please. That was... I took a word. I know you said a lot of words, but I took a word that I liked, which was a blame storm. I like that. Anna, my boss, I think we should do that on a Monday morning. We can create a blame storm for my performance. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jose's come all the way from Portugal to hand around a microphone. So, Jose with the microphone. So, we have the opportunity to ask some questions for Paddy, and please take this opportunity to ask some questions. So, are there any questions in the audience? Put your hands up, identify yourselves. Oh, he's on the way. Perfect. So, if you could introduce yourself and then go from there, that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Good morning. Linda Tuck-Chapman, Ontala from Canada.
I'm so sorry.
So I have a question for you about 5G networks. This introduces a new level of risk to organizations. And could you share your thoughts about what those risks might be and how we might mitigate them, please?
So could you just focus that in for me? Do you want me to go into the supply chain risk, or do you want me to talk about?
I was really thinking about the data security risk, because we now have different layers of software, and we have a lot of repeaters basically. So the hardware has changed. We used to manage endpoint security, I think, for telecommunications, and now the game has changed considerably with 5G networks.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm struck by the coming transformation behind 5G. So if you think about the logic of 5G, 5G is the relationship between a device, or as you say, a moving endpoint, and the first switch, and the RAN. And then there's some architectural aspects to it, but significant, there are going to have to be some significant other developments behind 5G for us to get the full value out of it. And I think therein lies some really interesting questions. I was involved in setting up. Well, I was associated with the setting up of the joint work with Huawei around 5G in the UK back in 2008, 9, 10, and then obviously I oversaw, when in government, aspects of the interaction with them. And I'm not going to particularly focus on Huawei because I think that's a great diversion, although I can give you my opinions on that if you want. But I think it brought about something really interesting. I think that the emergence of these technologies places an enormous obligation on the part of the backbone provider and of government, depending on who operates it, to have a real holistic understanding of what is happening on the network. And if one talks about network resilience, so if you imagine you back right up, and I used to chair a group of the UK's, the British government departments interested in telephony, and then, or telecommunications, and then facing us, the CEOs of the major telephone companies, BT, Verizon, whoever it might be, O2, all of them in a room facing, talking to us, and we kind of co-chaired and worked it together. And what we were interested in was having a resilient telecommunications network. And I think that's where the issue is going to come. There's going to be a very rapid evolution around 5G technology. We're heavily focused on 5G technology. Some of the stuff around automation, if you look at the work that the German and particularly the Bavarian car industry has done around standards for automated vehicles, you can begin to see that you're going to have some consistency and something there. But I think it's the larger development, in a sense almost behind the RAN, behind the switch, that is going to be the really interesting area for government. You'll recognise that both in legislation and technically, governments tend to have to play catch-up. Those who have large signals intelligence organisations tend to be slightly quicker than those that don't, but in terms of the technology. But legislation and regulation is consistently 10 years behind the mark. It's very striking to me that here we are in 2019, and there's been discussion in the British Parliament about what you do about taxing Facebook and other similar, I should say, other social media platforms are available, and taxing Facebook and indeed managing content. So here we are in 2019 with legislation. You'll all remember that it was about in 2009 that we had kind of peak emergence of Facebook. So there's a kind of 10-year block. So I think that's my worry there. Areas where we've had heavy focus, which actually is the 5G technology itself and continues to be, and some of the automation I have more confidence, but it's the larger system around it that I'm concerned about, I think. Anything?
Any other questions for Paddy?
Otherwise, you're going to have to ask me a question.
Yeah, I think we've got one. Always at the back of the room, Jose. Just keep you going.
Some of you must have questions.
My name is Imre. I'm from Hungary, from a small consulting company, and listening to the introductory speeches, there are always recurring themes this community has been talking about for like 20 years. Culture, ethics, looking for So Paddy, based on your experience, do you see any hope? I'm hoping that you're hopeful as well about the boards of companies being able to grasp the risks and look forward instead of just going quarter by quarter, looking at the budget, etc. So I hope you get what I mean.
So I think the behavior you're describing is an existential issue for boards. You know, that companies that are able to understand the change that is upon them and do something about it are going to succeed. And it's been very disturbing for me to see companies that have aggregated data and made no use of it. We're going to have a panel shortly, and I don't want to say everything I would say on the panel, but I'll say one of the things that strikes me is there is very little leeway in business today. The light changes very quickly. One day you're making and distributing water in bottles and selling it, and people are a little bit concerned about it. David Attenborough makes a television program, and suddenly you are the devil incarnate, using single-use plastic, and you've got to get out of it. Yeah. So there's a thing about speed of reaction, but there's also a thing about, frankly, looking forward and really thinking. My personal view is that one of the objectives of every board should be to get the priceable risks almost off their agenda. Yeah, and you see this in the finance sector. If you look at the way that retail banks deal with fraud, that they understand fully what the indicators are of fraud. They know what the acceptable, inverted, manageable parameters are. If it gets outside there, they take action, but they manage it, and it's managed down. The board is aware of it, but it's not the main thing for the board. So it's a thing about priceable risk, which is about understanding what's happening. Two things strike me. One is the thing I've already said about later, and not that much later, 5 to 7 years, there are going to be transformational technologies that are going to be general that deal with some of the current unpriced risk and give opportunities. And I know you've got various sessions on machine learning and AI coming up, including with colleagues and friends of mine speaking to you. So I won't labour that too much. But the other one is, and I think GDPR is really helpful with this. You don't often hear people saying that. GDPR is really helpful. Is really helpful with this is that division that I described in the security principle, where, and it doesn't apply to everyone, but you just have this in mind, where you've got to take technical and organizational measures appropriate to the risk. So you're dealing with data, and of course you're going to have technical measures, and you're going to have controls, and you're going to, absolutely you're going to have all of that. Organizational, that's really interesting, isn't it? When you go and do a simulation for a company, and half the board are, I don't know, playing Angry Bird or emailing or something, as you do because they say, I'm in HR, what's this got to do with me? I'm the CFO, I'm kind of interested in what they spend, but actually, Andy's got it. He's the tech guy, he's got it. Yeah? That terrifies me. When I go into a company and it's the general counsel board secretary, or possibly the CFO, or a non-technical officer who has a responsibility for technology risk in the data and technology risk in the round, not just cyber, my heart lifts. So there's something really interesting about what's coming for boards. And you can see them, I see them wrestling with it. The best companies, I see them wrestling with it, avoiding the pitfalls of having a technical expert, because that means that the whole board doesn't do it. And though, of course, those that have suffered a major event, whatever it might be, I was in with Bob Dudley of BP and met some of his leadership team, all that's happened to that company, my word, they have set themselves to deal with adversity. My word, everybody feels that they have a stake in these significant unpriced risk areas, and I think that's the change. Your point about 20 years of waiting for this is coming really, really fast. It's coming really fast. You know it in GRC's products, but you know it in your competitor arena too, whatever your business is. This stuff is coming fast. So I think the timelines are shortening. So then that's really interesting conversation. The most exciting business leaders, to my mind, are the ones who are saying, we're getting better and better at this stuff, but I'm itchy. I'm looking up and out, and I'm itchy about how we're going to make use of the opportunity that's coming.
We've got one at the front, Jose. Thanks.
Can I say I'm really glad no one's asked me a question which, if quoted, could get involved in the general election, and can we just keep it that way? I did an event last week where I was asked questions about Europe, about governmental competence. It's a complete nightmare.
No, not about general elections. I'm going to stick to boards. You've been quite disparaging about boards and the capability to deal with the issues you've talked about. What kind, at the risk of you having to join every board, or the number of friends that you have here today populating boards entirely, what kind of skills do you think need to come into board environments to deal with the very serious issues that you've identified?
So I hope I haven't been disparaging about boards. I think what I've done is I've identified a role for boards, and then sometimes you see boards performing that role wonderfully. Obviously, when you the whole point about real uncertainty is that a MetricStream or Paddy McGuinness or KPMG can't completely resolve it for you. You've got to have a tolerance for it, and like a four-wheel drive vehicle, you've got to be able to drive over it. The best boards are like that. I could name some. I've seen some. They're very, very good. There are some pitfalls, I think, for boards, as I said. There are those great things, aren't there, when it comes to technology and cyber risk, that are key indicators, if you ever hear any of these. So we've doubled our spend on cyber security, which means I understand the balance sheet, but I'm not quite sure what we're doing. Andy's got it. He sorts it for me. We've got, and then insert a technology name here. I know CrowdStrike, Darktrace, IronNet, just two words that don't naturally go together. Yeah? We wouldn't be a target. Okay, that's a really bad one, yeah? And we're really well connected with government. If something happened, they'd come and help us, which I hear in many parts of the world. You remember Ronald Reagan's great line, the most frightening phrase in the English language was, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you." And in the cyber arena, it's a little bit that way. So I think there are some characteristics you see on boards. I think it's about an articulated approach. And that's one of the reasons why I find myself talking to CEOs, with them asking the question, how can I get this organizational aspect right? So I think a lot of the skills are there on the boards. Putting cyber experts or data experts on is a mistake. Getting everyone to understand the emerging technology that's going to benefit your business seems to me to be a critical element. Frankly, if I could get to that point where I had that product and could deliver it consistently, I'd be a very rich person, as would our sponsors today. They're doing a fair bit of it. We're all having a go at it. It seems to me it's in that area. So don't think I'm being disparaging about boards. There is a thing about just how you have the right conversation. The right conversation is, I'm afraid, increasingly not about the risk presentation that you get on data and cyber and technology risk, which tells you how your spear phishing campaigns are going. I mean, that's important, but that's not the thing.
Brilliant. I've just got one question before we wrap up.
Go ahead.
If that's okay. Thanks. Keep calm. Carry on.
Yeah.
That one, definitely not the other one.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Keep calm, carry on. So obviously in a board, when there's a crisis, stuff happens, stuff's talked about. But the world's not watching. The entire press is not watching. There are not people with cameras potentially in the face. There's not a clicking clock, tick-tock, tick-tock, and that pressure cooker of a crisis. Now, clearly from your position in a cabinet office, in a COBRA, in a cabinet office briefing room, what's that like? Is it a calm place? Or is it a pressure place? Talk me through, you walk in, there's a crisis. You've named a few of the worst crises the British have had in my lifetime. What's it like?
It's a machine.
It's a machine.
It's a machine that doesn't rely on, that's got strength and depth. It's a machine. You take the whole of the British government into a room. You always do it the same way. Think about John Major, John Major was our Prime Minister in the 1990s, and at that point we had a problem with my cousins being McGuinness, is quite something. Martin McGuinness, the leader there, when we went to negotiate the Stormont House Agreement, I'm there with David Cameron, and we walk into the room, and Martin McGuinness goes, Paddy, my Klansman. And all the British side go, what the hell, what's this bloke doing with us? So you have a system, and you run it. The most frightening moment for me, as the person who had to make it, was, so you imagine, something happens, I'd ring out the Prime Minister and say, something's happened.
Yeah.
Or I'd ring out the Private Secretary to speak to him, and I'd get on with what I had to do. I'd then go in and see him just beforehand, I'd give him a brief and say, right, here you go. I'd always give him a thing, which one of my staff had written, which even if he was completely exhausted, drunk, frightened, would tell him how to frame the meeting. We'd always run it the same way. We'd always do it in the same sequence. The most frightening moment for me was when I had a new government or new ministers, because they hadn't sat together. So it goes to the point about boards, isn't it? And this question about how you deal with black swan events, that a board that has really worked out how you talk to each other and work together in adversity, ideally before adversity, is well prepared. You know, is what you want in a business to maintain value. It's speed of response and the fact you're comfortable with each other and you're not just going to wear each other out. Learning during a crisis is really, really, really bad. Yeah. So that was the moment. So the answer is it's a machine, it's grown up, it's being used. As I said though, my worry about it is that if you get used to making decisions that way, it's very attractive making decisions that way, but that itself develops a risk, a danger, that you make decisions on the hoof, that you rely on driving on the brakes.
Emotion?
Well, we take emotion out of it.
Right.
And that was part of my job. So I'd sit there, imagine during...
I can't.
Can you not
I'll
imagine?
try it. I can't. I don't think they'd let me through the door, Paddy, but yeah, okay.
No, you're a bit lively. I'm not sure. We had a back room for people like you.
I really did. It's like being at school again, Paddy.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But you know, I sat here, I mean, so the most frightening moment for me when I was in government service, in that job, was the Granville Tower fire. The British people will remember. And the reason it was frightening was that isn't a national security issue, isn't really a resilience issue. I shouldn't really have been dealing with it. But the fabric of society tore. The local structures that should have dealt with it couldn't deal with it, and then the government departments that should have dealt with it couldn't deal with it. And I went into the Prime Minister and said, you know, after you remember Theresa May did a visit to the area and then was criticised for the way she did it, and so she was vulnerable then and uncomfortable, and I said to her, let's use the machine, because the machine is calm and works. And so we took it into the national security space and chaired those meetings. But that was frightening because you could feel that we'd lost consent. And in the United Kingdom, you rule by consent. So if a chunk of the country decides it's not going to be with you anymore, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So, but otherwise, I was calm.
I love it. I need you to come to my family dinners on a Sunday afternoon, I think, and just calm everyone down and put it into a process. Ladies and gentlemen, I could listen to Paddy all day. I really could.
Thanks so much.
But Paddy, you're staying around?
I'm staying around. Yeah, great. We're having some
lunchtime,
chairs.
I think.
Yeah,
So,
great.
ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm round of applause for Paddy.